Good morning, good afternoon, everyone, wherever you are in the world. We're just going to give it a minute or so before we get started. I can see that there's quite a few people, as always, an influx of people joining right on the hour. So let's just give it a minute or two, and we will, we'll kick things off. Be right back. Cheers, everyone. All right, it looks as though there's a good number of us here now. Welcome to those that have just joined. Good morning, good afternoon, wherever you are in the world. It's great to have so many of you here. I can see some familiar names as well, so it's fantastic. Yeah, welcome to the webinar, jointly hosted by Lepide, ourselves here at Lepide, and Sherpa. This is the first in our series of security debates, and today we're really asking the question, is zero trust the magic bullet for data security? Just before I pass over to my colleagues, Rick Wilson over at Sherpa and Aidan Simister, our CEO here at Lepide, just a couple of housekeeping bits really. All the microphones are muted for the duration of this session today. However, that's really just to keep the noise down because there's quite a few people here. However, if you've got any questions, please feel free to drop those questions into the questions pane as we go along. What I'll probably do is I'll let the guys continue with the debate, and I'll answer any questions in the background if there are any. We expect this debate to run for about 30 minutes today, and we should have some time at the end of the session today for further questions and answers that I'll be happy to go through with everyone. So I guess without further ado, I'm now going to hand it over to our speakers. So over to you guys.
Thank you very much for joining us. My name's Aidan Simister. I'm the CEO of Lepide. I'm joined also by Rick over at one of our alliance partners, Sherpa. Hi, Rick. Thanks for joining us.
Aidan, so pleased to be with you today. Thanks for inviting us to engage in this debate with you. We have a lot to say as well.
We do indeed. So we really want to just have the conversation around zero trust. We hear this term used quite a lot. So what we're really going to kind of cover off today is going to briefly just introduce what we do and our company. And of course, Rick, I'd like you to perhaps explain a bit about what Sherpa do, and then really, why we're talking about zero trust, and really just sort of cover off what does it mean and what is it, because I think there's a fair amount of confusion as to actually what zero trust is, and then perhaps just give some practical tips, some frameworks and some information around some of the ways that you can go around implementing zero trust in the various flavors that there are of this as well, because it really matters. And I really want to touch on that when we get towards the end, like why this is really important that we actually do this as well. So that's what I'd like to try and cover off with the next session.
Right.
For the next sort of probably going to spend 25 minutes, half an hour, something around that region, just to set some expectations. So, Rick, I'll pass this off to you. Would you perhaps just briefly introduce Sherpa and explain what you guys do? That'd be really helpful for a start point.
Happy to do it, Aidan. So as you well know, and for the benefit of our listeners, Sherpa is a US-based software development company. We're about to celebrate our 20th anniversary. So we've been doing this for a long time, building software to help our customers manage their electronic content in lots of ways and shapes. So that could be something as simple as applying a retention policy to your mailboxes in your Exchange environment. And believe it or not, we started with Lotus Notes for that mail management. But then we've got a whole layer of additional capabilities for governance and e-discovery and so forth. So as you can see on the slide, we've got a number of customers in many countries, some of them right there in the UK, and certainly a number of other locations. And we've got a lot of experience helping customers just wrap their arms around what's in their electronic content and then how they want to control that moving forward.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think that, the relationship that we have with Sherpa is that, you're really strong at that whole governance side of the story. Whereas I think about sort of where we're coming from, we've really come from this security place. So really, we're all about making sure that you understand what's happening to your unstructured data, where your most sensitive unstructured data is, who's got access to it from a security standpoint. So, again, we have 3 offices, an office over in North America, over in Texas, an office in the UK, which is where I'm based, hence the accent. And we also have an office over in Asia as well. Got about 1,000 customers, and they tend to be mid to large size organizations that we typically deal with. So let's sort of just get into this. So why have we put together this webinar? Well, Zero Trust is not new. This is a term that, I've been using this term. I've heard of this term. We're going back sort of 15 years ago in various guises. I'm not even sure if it was called Zero Trust then, but this concept of Zero Trust is not new. But the actual the term was first coined by Forrester back in 2010. And it really sort of maintains that this concept of the perimeter is dead. This concept that you have a moat around your castle and it's going to keep it safe, that just is no longer effective. So we hear a lot of people talking about Zero Trust, so we just wanted to talk a bit more about what it is and perhaps what it isn't in this session as well. So Rick, I'm going to start with you. How do you define Zero Trust? What do you think Zero Trust is?
Well, the way I most often see it in context, Aid, and by the way, you're right, I can barely open up my mailbox today without seeing some kind of message about Zero Trust. So it's really trendy right now. The way that I most often see it is from the standpoint of vendors selling security software that want to apply a lot of access controls to where the information is being kept, who can access it. So it's that concept of a username and password is not good enough. We need to have a little bit more information or a little bit more precise control other than just validating that you in fact have a username and password.
Right, absolutely, yeah, because I think you're right. And I think the difficulty is, I think Zero Trust is a really, really important concept, and it's absolutely something that organizations need to do. But because of our marketing departments and security vendors, it's becoming one of these terms that's becoming overlooked because another email about Zero Trust, and it's it's almost counterproductive sometimes, right?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, indeed.
I think the other difficulty is a lot of vendors, marketing teams, they use the term Zero Trust to reflect what their agenda is. And I totally understand that. And I know that we're guilty of this as well. So I kind of like to think about Zero Trust in kind of four flavors, as you were. So I think there's basically, you have Zero Trust where we're talking about the data, like how can we make sure that we have a data-centric approach to granting access as well? How can you have that and a Zero Trust approach around the users and the employees? So what are people doing? Are people acting responsibly? Have they earned the right to be able to do the things they're doing with the data they have access to? And then obviously, you have Zero Trust around perhaps networks or network devices that also are connecting in, making sure that you actually you're applying those principles to those aspects of your security as well. I think today we're going to probably more focus on the flavors 1 and 2 there, really. Mm-hmm. But I think they're the things that really, really matter. I think they're the things that so many organizations haven't quite yet figured out. When I think about Zero Trust, it's essentially a framework of paranoia. It's essentially a framework where you have to operate from that position, not that, will we get hacked? It's a case of you have to operate from positions like, so we have adversaries already inside our organization. You have to operate with this concept that perimeter security is flawed from the outset. You have to operate from that place. That's the only way we're going to be effective. Rick, any thoughts on that?
Well, I think you're probably right, Aiden. I think that a lot of the security professionals oftentimes tend to take that to extreme. So at the peril of impacting their business operations because they're trying to be a little bit too draconian about how they're locking down that information. I'm sure we'll get into that as we touch on the data centric, but yeah, absolutely.
Absolutely, yeah. I think one thing as well that I find rather strange and concerning is that we see a lot of organisations that define trust as, well, they've logged on with a username and password, so that must mean that we should trust them. Like, they have legitimate access, but so that means we should trust them. But I think you need to go much deeper. Like, trust should not be based on behavior. Trust should be based on behavior. It should be earned and maintained. We shouldn't just be granting trust. We shouldn't just be granting access because they are legitimately using the credentials. Because what happens if an employee goes rogue? What if it happens if that employee becomes compromised, right? So I think that we should rethink the way that we're granting access to things, and it should start from that position of, I'm going to grant you access to as little as I possibly can until I know I can trust you, until I know that it genuinely is you, that you're acting in a responsible way, in an appropriate way, not just because you've been granted a username and password to enter my network.
And I know we're going to touch on this a bit in the next installment of the webinar, Aidan, but then verify that, in fact, as I begin to parcel out some trust to you, that you're responsibly handling it.
Absolutely right. Absolutely right. Yeah, exactly. Yeah. So when I think about, the two angles, because obviously we're coming at this from two very different angles. When I think about, for us, I mean, our whole strap line, everything we talk about is that security should start with the data and it work its way out from there. Security is currently the wrong way round. Like, still, and I find this quite strange because we've been talking about this perimeter being dead for so long, and yet that we still see so many organizations that are thinking about protecting their castle by digging a bigger moat, by spending more money on keeping the bad guys out, like from the outside in. And I think that that's wrong. I believe that security needs to become more data centric. It needs to get as close to the things that companies are trying to protect to be effective, because it only takes one infiltration. It only takes one person inside the organization to cause significant damage. So you need to get close to what you want to protect, and you need to understand that deeply and prioritize your security efforts to be effective. I mean, from your perspective, from that governance perspective, talk to me a bit about where you see you fitting into this zero trust model as well.
Yeah, absolutely. So I perhaps an extension maybe of what you just described. So our mandate is, or sort of our stance on this is, you cannot imperil the business. Your business unit people, your sales people, your marketing people, your frontline workers, I mean, they need to be able to get to the information they need to conduct whatever your mission is as an operating enterprise. That means we can't impede them. Our challenge as security people then is to find a way to allow them to get their jobs done, but make sure they're playing within the guide rails that have been established. That's where the challenge comes. So our approach has always been to provide tools that would allow the security folks to be able to do that. Don't impede the business, but yet make sure they're playing by the rules.
Really interesting. And I think that why that's interesting is, I think that with recent advents of everybody working from home, I think that that's made zero trust more important now than ever before. Like, the need to understand, what employees really need to have access to, and that need to understand what employees are doing with the data has got even greater, I'd say.
Absolutely.
Which probably brings me on to this, like, why does it matter? It really matters. It really matters, because if we don't come from this position of actually rethinking our security, breaches are going to continue to increase. People are going to continue to have issues with people stealing their data, with adversaries as well, because traditional security it fails, and it fails because of a number of reasons. It fails because organizations fail to get value out of legacy security. They spent all this money. It fails because legacy security fails to talk to one another, so they can't actually get the value they need from the investments that they've made. But it fundamentally fails because threats have become so much about getting at the data, and traditional security isn't thinking in that way. It's not giving you enough context around the stuff that really matters. So and again, with this situation where this is, if there was a concept of a perimeter before, certainly with everyone working from home, that's really become even more of a challenge. That perimeter at a folder level, it has to get down to that level for it to be effective, or for organizations to be effective in keeping things secure today. Like, I think it matters now more than it ever has at any point in history. I think it really matters.
No question, Aidan. And we're not going back from here, right? I mean, I'm sure you're getting bombarded with these messages too. We're all trying to understand, what does business life look like in the next 5 years, now that we're in this hopefully close to post-pandemic situation. But I know for ourselves, we're not back in the office yet. I know some of your team is, but that dynamic is something we're going to have to learn to live with and manage around from a security point of view.
Sure. See, I find it really, when I think about Zero Trust, I think about this in terms of how security used to be, right? So my father used to work for a shipping company, okay? And when you first joined the organization, you were granted very little access to what you could see, what documents you could see. You weren't given a set of keys. You had pretty much no privileges, and you had to be there quite a number of years before you were given permission to enable you to enter the filing cabinet room. And it took even more years until you could get the keys to specific filing cabinets contained really sensitive information. And you had to earn the right to actually hold those keys. You had to earn the right to be able to look at that data, and you had to prove to the organization that you were going to act responsibly if you had those privileges. It was treated as a privilege. So it used to be Zero Trust. That was the way that we used to think about data. That was the way we used to think about information. Whereas that's sort of gone away, and I feel we need to get back to that. But I do appreciate that's obviously very difficult when you deal with the sheer volume of data, and the mechanisms in which access to data is granted, and the fact that everyone wants everything immediately straight away, and you want to try and enable businesses. But we've gone too far the other way. I feel we've lost this respect. We've lost that respect for data that perhaps we once had.
Delivering tools, as both you and I do in our organizations, delivering tools that allow that level of oversight, given the situation you just described. Mountains of data coming from many, many disparate sources, data dispersed into a lot of locations, is really the key behind being able to do this kind of a trust initiative in that environment.
Right. And I think that this is also where, and we're going to talk about this on the next webinar, this trust but verify thing comes into play as well. This is probably a lot more practical to say, well, I'm not going to hold them back. I'm going to allow them to access within reason, right? I'm going to have controls to make sure that, they're not overprivileged, but I'm going to make sure that they're doing what they're supposed to be doing, what they ought to be doing, and they're not overprivileged. But you're starting from that. I'm going to trust them by default. I'm going to verify they're doing what they want, or they've got the right levels of access. So that's probably a lot more practical rather than Zero Trust in itself.
Yeah, totally agree. And I think your point's well taken. That's the world we live in today, right?
Yeah. I think fundamentally, I think that before we even think about Zero Trust, I think the problem is we've got a long way to go to get zero. At the moment, it's trust everybody to a large extent. Most organizations don't actually know who's got access to what. They don't know what's happening to their data, and they don't know, on the large part, really what data they hold and whether it's sensitive. So I think we've got a long way to get to zero. We've got a long way to get to zero. I think we need to probably just start almost sort of figuring out, maybe like prioritizing what initiatives we take to work towards Zero Trust, and starting off from a slightly different stance. I think Zero Trust is a great strategy, but how practical it really is, for a lot of organizations in the current state, it's quite a long journey, I'd say.
And just like a governance program, you can't tackle this in its entirety all at once. You have to do
No,
it in bite-sized chunks, right? Take an area and
right.
address that area and then move on to the next.
And I think that quite often is the challenge. I think a lot that it's an incredibly daunting initiative. It requires a lot of cooperation from a lot of different people and a lot of different teams to actually make it successful. And I think that, frankly, I think that the availability of tools, the market has been quite badly served by tools to help companies do this that are just far too complicated, far too expensive, and actually it's just not been tangible for most organizations to even think about attempting initiatives around this. I think it's been too daunting, but I think it's going to change. I think it's getting easier. I mean, and I'm not just talking about us, but the market for the types of things that we do has got infinitely bigger, and there's more choice and there's more options for companies that want to do a better job of understanding their data than ever before. So that's got to help.
No question. And I'll throw this in. This may not be the appropriate place for it, but for the CISOs that are listening in on this call, I think there's also a PR problem with this whole term of zero trust, right? If I, as a CISO, I'm going to stand in front of my business unit people and proudly declare that we're going to implement a zero trust policy, I'm going to have a bunch of angry business unit managers, and why don't you trust us? And, so I think there's a whole a branding, packaging sort of a way to approach this as well that might be part of the discussion.
Yeah, you're absolutely right as well. I mean, this is the point. Security have a hard enough time as it is trying to prove that they really are business enablers, and any initiative that's going to make it look like that's putting any kind of barriers up to restrict productivity or even damage any kind of cultural trust that perhaps might exist, it has to be approached very sensitively. Yeah, I agree. It is problematic.
Right.
Yeah. So where to start? How can companies try and be more effective in working towards zero trust? I mean, I think that there's a few things that I think that there's a few ideologies and a few concepts that I think that companies need to have when they're thinking about trying to be more secure, getting towards this model of zero trust, that I think we need to try and think about a bit deeper. I think that, we need to kind of assume everything and everyone is a threat, and that doesn't need to necessarily have negative connotations. I'm not saying that everything and everyone is a threat, but you need to have that mindset. You need to have that mindset that somebody is already inside my organization that shouldn't be there. I've got someone inside my organization that has become compromised, or they potentially can't be trusted, and I need to operate from that standpoint. It's kind of this concept of expect what you inspect, right? So assume everything is a threat. That should be one of the fundamental pillars of thinking about zero trust. It sounds obvious, but so many organizations trust is not a security strategy. And operating well, I bought this great tech, so I must be secure. I bought something that's yellow, so it's great, it must work. It's just flawed. Like, you have to assume everything and everyone is a threat. And I think that this is a process. Limiting privileges to the things that really matter. Like, at the fundamental level, what is it you're trying to protect? At the very beginning, let's think about what are the things inside the organization that really matter the most. So let's just data, right? So if you have a file in your organization that contains all of your customer details on, if you have a file in your organization that contains a ton of credit card information, that contains healthcare data, right? So for a start, that stuff really matters, right? So you at very least start to work towards limiting privileges and permissions to these things, right? You probably can't do it to everything. But you need to start the process by identifying what are the things that really matter. What are the things that could do the most amount of damage to my organization if they were to become abused, if they were to become breached? How can I limit the exposure that I have as an organization should someone become infected? Should someone become rogue? How can I do that? The first thing you can do is prioritizing and limiting privileges and permissions to the things that really matter. I think that that's really important as well.
Yeah, as you
and I know
pointed
that
out,
obviously it's one of the big things that you guys do, of course, you know.
right. As you pointed out, I didn't mean to talk over you there. As determining what really matters, it varies so much from organization to organization. We had a presentation with a major bank earlier this year, and it kind of surprised me a little bit as we were talking about types of data that they could perhaps discover and control. We were talking about things like the U.S. Social Security number identifiers. And the CISO said, look, I'm not worried about that kind of information because so much of it's already leaked and available on the dark web. I'm interested in our intellectual property. I want to know who has access to our IP. What are they doing with it? Why do they have it? So that definition of what really matters, you really have to kind of dig into your organization and answer that question because it's going to vary from place to place, of course.
Yeah, and that's not just an IT question quite often as well, because there might be specific things in the organization that matter now that perhaps won't matter in 5 years' time.
Absolutely.
So it's understanding the context that, and that involves security engaging with business units to understand what is it as a department, as an organization, as a business, what is it that could create the most risk at this one point in time to our organization. Yeah. That's interesting. Yeah. And I think that at very least, right, even if you're not able to figure out or limit privileges to the data that really matters, make sure that you at very least know what's happening to it, right? So you've got mechanisms to be able to detect anomalous behavior around the things that you've granted access to. Make sure that you understand what's happening to your most sensitive data. Even if you've got a bunch of people that have access to some data that is really sensitive, but you don't want to perhaps risk any friction by removing their access, very least make sure you've got the ability to figure out if people are doing things with it that they shouldn't be doing, that perhaps they don't normally do. Ensure you've got the ability to protect the data at very least by tracking behavior, understanding activity. And that's a really good mechanism to figure out, like, are they acting in a way that's appropriate for them to have that level of access? So understanding it from that side is also really important as well.
No question.
So, fundamentally, for me, like, it really comes down to figuring out where your data is, figuring out what is it you're actually trying to limit access to, what is it you really need to figure out, who should actually really have access to this data, and really make sure that if you can't do that, if you don't have the time, the resources, or the tools to understand where it is, make sure that you understand at very least what's happening to it, and you have some type of a process, even if that involves around data owners, to make sure that you have some mechanisms in place to detect suspicious anomalous activity around the stuff that matters the most. So, this is important as well, and it's so often forgotten. Absolutely. But again, it shouldn't be complicated, but the reality is the tools that most organizations have at their disposal don't give them this type of information. They're relying heavily on event logs, which gives you very little information, or they've got disparate solutions. They've got one vendor that helps them figure out where some of their data is. Maybe they've got one vendor that helps them figure out who's got access to stuff. They've got another one that helps them figure out what people are doing, but they don't talk to each other. So you end up in this position where you've got a ton of tech, none of it works together, and very little value, and a project that delivers nothing.
And really, isn't that the reason that we started to work cooperatively together? Because
exactly.
you can't complete the whole picture with one product. I don't believe it's feasible to do that. And we can answer or help our clients answer both sides of that equation.
That's right.
Where is it? What's sensitive? Where's it at? And then who can work with it, manage it, access it? It's critical to have two products that work together there.
But for me, it's about giving organizations the tools to enable to start that journey to work towards zero trust. And, you know, you can't do everything. You know, there's no such thing as like a one-click zero trust solution. But like, I believe that, like, you know, with the work that I know you and I have done together on some of the projects, you know, we can help them actually start to prioritize and start to work out what are the things that we really need to restrict access to. What are the types of threats to the stuff that matters the most that we need to be looking out for? How can we help, even if an organization is at that trust but verify stage, how can we help them understand if people are acting responsibly around that as well? And I think that's the type of value that I think companies should be trying to look for, I think, really. But yeah.
Clearly.
And I think in the next session, we're really going to talk about this as well. And I think probably we're going to go into a lot more detail. But, you know, whether you go for this zero trust or trust but verify mechanism, I mean, I think everyone should work towards zero trust, but the reality is probably it's much more realistic that trust but verify is a better strategy. But we'll go into that in a lot more detail in the next webinar, which we're going to be hosting next week. So yeah, I think probably we're coming to the end of time now, Rick, but have you any other points to add? Any other questions to add at this stage?
No, looking forward to that, continuing that discussion next week, Aidan. I think there's still a lot of ground to cover that we can help
Absolutely.
our joint audience understand in terms of how they can maybe begin to approach these kinds of projects and maybe some places to start, some practical tips of what other customers are doing. So looking forward to that discussion.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, it's such an important topic. And again, it's more important now than ever. And I think in the next session as well, we'll touch a little bit more about mobile, you know, about the home workers and mobile security and how that fits into this trust but verify story as well. Because I think that's quite a poignant topic at the moment as well.
Absolutely. Good. Well, thanks for inviting us to join you on this. It's been great talking with you today. And I hope everybody turns in for the next session.
Rick, I really appreciate it. Thank you very much.
Yeah, my pleasure.
Well, I was on mute there. Actually, guys, just before we conclude, I think it would be good to see if anyone's got any questions. Actually, we've got a bit of time, so yeah, thanks for that. You see any questions in there, Rick?
No, I don't right offhand, Danny.
Okay. Oh yeah, okay, yeah. So, I'm glad you found it useful. This is from James. Yeah, so this session obviously is recorded. Probably should have said that at the beginning. So we'll be sending a link out to that recording as well. Yeah. Cool. I think that's that then. All right, thanks a lot. Thanks again, guys, and thanks everyone for attending. Yeah, I hope you found it useful, and if you did, we look forward to seeing you on the next section of this debate on the 27th. So yeah, great. Thanks everyone. Enjoy the rest of your day. Cheers. Bye.